Suzan and Suzan, coming to talk to us about some really topical stuff that I hope everyone will get something out of tonight, talking about the ethical data minefield. So that's going to be really good, and we'll get started with that in just a moment. At the end of the presentation, we might have a small spot for questions and answers, and we'll also have a community marketplace. So if anyone has an event or a group or something happening related to data and data engineering, if someone's looking for a job or someone has an opportunity for someone to get involved in data engineering, then we'll do a community marketplace, which is a bit of an open forum for people to give a 60-second pitch on what their skills and experience are and what they might bring, or perhaps an opportunity that people might be interested in talking to you about. During the talk, if you want to think about something to share in the community marketplace, that'll be coming up just after the talk. So without further ado, let's hand over to Maya and Suzan to present.
Thank you. I'm going to let Suzan drive the slides.
Can you see?
Yes.
Awesome.
Great. Okay. We're going to be talking about basically testing for ethical use of data, which is a whole heap of big words that have a whole heap of big feelings associated with them. There will be a few spots for audience participation. Please feel free to unmute at those times and speak up. See how we go. All right, we should probably do introductions. My name is Maia-West. I'm, what do I do? These days I'm a project manager. Once upon a time, I was probably about a quarter of an epidemiologist. And mostly what I do is herd cats in the technical world. I'll let Suzan introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. We're very happy to be talking to you today. I'm Suzan, and I also work for ThoughtWorks. I also don't know how to describe what I do, like many of us there. I guess officially I'm a technical QA, but I wear many different hats. Sometimes I'm a project manager if need be. I'm a BA, I'm a dev. And I'm still figuring out which one I like to do most, so stay tuned. All right,
Awesome.
Maya, I'll hand over to you to get started.
Okay, so what we're talking about, you know, we've kind of given this a semi-facetious title of every software project is an ethical data minefield, but that's kind of true. And by the end of our talk today, we'll have covered ethical use of data. What is it? Why do we care about it? How do we test for it? Some kind of useful language types for using around it, and a bunch of different resources. Let's define our terms. What are we even talking about? What is ethical use of data? Yeah, it's a great question. Here we go. What do you think when you hear ethical data? Go on. Feel free to unmute.
Well,
Yes, yeah, go on, please.
When I think of ethical data, I think about using it appropriately, particularly things like people's names and addresses and that sort of stuff, and then making sure that it's only given to the right people.
Yep.
So not misusing data in any way.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah, what's misusing? That's a great, yeah.
And what's anyway?
Yeah, but that's exactly right. All of these terms are sort of fractally complex. Anyone else?
It's also, yeah, you go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say it could be to do with using data in an not to deceive people. So sometimes somebody has a viewpoint, especially in politics, and then they get some data and they make some visualizations and they just make the visualization look like what they want the data to say, but it's not actually what the data says.
Yep. Yep, that's right.
Actually, what I wanted to say too, like it's not just how it's like stored and kept securely, but how it's presented and interpreted. Like, yeah.
That's right. Yep.
What about?
I was also going to add willingly collected or willingly given, because I don't really like the fact that Facebook tracks the other sites I have open when I also have Facebook open, but I don't seem to be able to stop that.
Yeah, that kind of thing. Yep. For those with a keen eye, there is an Easter egg on the slide. There is an actual word bacon inserted somewhere where it really shouldn't be, in the data Spartan bacon word, which is actually generally a different word, but I can't pronounce it. And the whole concept is only gather what you need and don't keep what you don't need. Yep. I think, yeah, let's move on. There'll be more audience participation soon, I promise. Okay. This is what most people think of when they think of what is ethical data usage. So we take data and we use it, and then we apply an ethical lens, and that gives us ethical use of data. That's kind of a lie. Let's be real. I'm going to be using some big broad terms, some bold statements. I think that is completely untrue. Every time you use data, you are making an ethical decision about how to use it. In the same way that anytime we make any decision, we apply our own personal ethics about it. That's just the way the world works. You already do ethics. You don't have to do anything special for it. You just do. Every time we're using data, we're making an ethics-informed choice. And we are making choices that affect the people who use the tools that we create. I really love that sticker by Authentic Engine, the all technical decisions are political. You can't kind of wear it everywhere because it can start the wrong kinds of conversations, or the kinds of conversations that aren't real helpful, but it's a really lovely concept to have around. Okay. Haha, audience participation time, great. Okay, so we've started thinking about this, like what is ethical data, but what is ethical use of data?
Feel free to unmute and share.
I would say it's using data for the purpose that it's being stored for.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, and there's often a lot of questions about, well, how do you know if it isn't? Yep. What else?
Yeah, because in case if you are adding an email ID to a site, but if they use it for their own purpose instead of, I mean, we think it's about assumption as well. We think they are using it to communicate to us, but they may be using it for different purpose. So, yeah.
Yep.
Using it without bias or preconceptions, and if that's achievable, well, that may not be achievable.
Yeah, oh, what a good point. There's no such thing as being without bias, unfortunately, but there is such a thing as changing your own bias. Yep, fair call. I'm really impressed, actually. Usually when you ask this kind of question, what is ethical use of data, people tend to come up with examples of unethical use of data. Because that tends
what
to be
not to do.
tends to be a lot more prevalent. Okay.
Maybe also being aware of the limitations and pointing those out. Like if you're not sure of the quality of your data sources, for example, if you don't know what sort of sampling error you might have, for example, then that's risky, and you need to keep that in mind and disclose it.
Yep, that's exactly right. Yeah, so being really aware of the limitations of what your data can tell you and what it can't tell you, and how you communicate that to the people that use it. Because if people end up just with the data, whatever that is, like, you know, with a table or a graph, you don't always have the interpretive overlay over it. Yeah, it's a good point. Okay, let's move on. Okay. You know what? I'm going to hand off to Suzan.
Thanks, Maya. So I think most of us have come into at least some examples of ethical use of data, what we think that could look like when it's a good example, a better example, a mediocre example, a terrible example, and what that would do to the interactions with the data users and the world. So ethical use of data when we think about it, we can give you a definition. This is just one, but there are many definitions out there. So when we say ethical use of data, we're thinking it's the application of ethical principles to data collection, storage, processing, and decision-making. And there's actually another invisible one there. Can anyone suggest maybe what we might be missing from there? You can unmute if you want.
Transparency.
Transparency is important, but what about data? If we think about data as an asset, like which it is, like any other asset, there needs to be actually plans for its disposal. So it's deleting. So it's not just that we collect, store, and process and make decisions about data or visualize data, or we need to actually make decisions and applications into disposing of that data. So what is data? Data is any information you can have or access. Can anyone think of things that might be included in that? When we think of data, what does that mean?
Like examples from, I don't know, say a software project you might work on.
Could be anything. Could be people's salary information.
Yeah.
Personal information.
Yep.
Yeah. Information collected from like Internet of Things devices.
Yeah, very good example.
Like Wi-Fi hubs, telling you all the MAC addresses of all the phones that go past.
Yes.
Surveys.
Nice. Yeah.
Information you put in, dating apps, when you put in your personal information or what you like, what you don't like.
Yeah, dating apps.
That data is mostly made up, so it doesn't really matter.
Still data, I would say.
Yes, complex ethical fields to navigate. Yes.
Yes.
Just go broad and say data is any recorded piece of information. It's potentially data to someone.
Yes, very good point. Very good point. So it's exactly what we mentioned and more. So it is things like customer data, dashboards, analytics, whether it's also location, logs, passwords, or login information. And it's also things that sometimes we don't think about, but you still have access to. Things like architecture diagrams, stakeholder maps, our databases, our personas, staff IDs, any reports that you're creating or collecting or publishing. This is also data that you have access to, and it may or may not be problematic to make it public. So all of this is information that you've got. All of this actually is data. So now if you think of data usage, so if we say data usage is acquiring, storing, manipulating, moving, or publishing data, what does that mean? What can that look like on a software project? Can you give me a bunch of examples?
Excellent.
One of the obvious ones that comes to me is behavioral data. Websites that track where you go and what you do and where you click, that then tailor advertising to that particular person or that behavior.
Yeah.
Real world example, on another screen, I'm compiling a data report to submit to the government for our yearly compliance.
Excellent.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Acquiring data could be a user signing up for your service on a web page or buying a list of email addresses from some dodgy person on the internet.
Yes. Good examples.
I think dodgy person on the internet is actually a really good example, because when you think about data as being information that's valuable and useful for someone, it also applies to the security world, which means that potentially bad actors, the more intel and information they have about a system or a network or a something, the more data they have about the people that use that system or have access to things in that system, particularly people with elevated privileges, that sort of thing. That's very useful for potentially malicious purposes.
The classic example of date of birth.
Yeah, that's a great point with when you mentioned bad actors, and keep that in mind because we're going to focus a bit more or talk a bit more about that in a minute. But those are great examples, and some data usage examples that we often think about include storage, dashboards, streaming services. APIs are a great example of data usage, the website content as well, but it's also a bunch of other things like logging email, your business rules that are stored as config files, for example. If you've done any user testing, surveys, as we mentioned before, that gather any data, those are actually examples of data usage as well. If you have things stored on mobile devices, that's also usage of data. Anything you've ever done with data in terms of storing it anywhere, thinking about it, publishing it, moving it around, in fact, deleting it is also an example of data usage.
Just a question, like, what about non-digital data? Like you might have data in other forms, like on paper, but even like your DNA, which you might leave behind somewhere, that's data that could, later be used against you. Yeah, that's like, like that's biological, but it's still it's still data.
Yes, I guess it is still data, and there is no limit to what is data, right? Because everything that holds any piece of information about you is considered data. So this is where it becomes even more important to talk about, well, how can we define an ethical use of data where we're minimizing harm? So I'm just going to keep that sort of in the air for a bit, and if we haven't answered or come close to answering that question towards the end, we can mention it again during question time. Is that okay? All right. All right, so we get to ethical data usage then. If we say ethical data usage is responsible and sustainable use of data, can we think of some examples within, let's say, the software development world? Or even in general? What are things we do to make sure that we're not misusing data?
So, for example, we never store passwords in plain text. We store hashes.
Yep.
So and we do that because that prevents, somebody with access to those passwords using them.
That's right. Hello, Twitter.
Yes. Any other examples?
Privacy laws,
Yes.
laws that surround the use of any sort of data.
Yep. Yes. One more?
Any sort of medical data which is used for research and probably creating vaccination, I mean, finding a cure or sort of thing.
Yes, great example. So when we think of ethical data usage, the most obvious stuff tends to be around legal protections, privacy protections. So things like passwords, regulation compliance, access controls. These are all attempts to make the data less identifiable, either by masking it or grouping it or something like that. This is basically the security of data. And when we say ethical data and we think straight away security is only but a subset of ethical use of data, just like data hygiene and many other things. But it's also things like what we mentioned before, the data Spartan Bacon, where we only gather what we need, and deleting and sunsetting data, having meaningful informed consent. Also, for example, licensing, putting controls on the way and the conditions under which the data you release can be used is a form of thinking about ethical applications. So not just my data, but other people's use of it. Also having a transparent process. So we mentioned transparency before. How is this data being gathered? Where is it going to be stored? How is it going to be used? Will you be contacted if we use your data differently? So these are all things to think about when we think about ethical use of data. And basically this comes to the conclusion that every software project then becomes a data project, because we are faced with complex decisions that we have to make about all this data that we're using in every single software project. We don't have to be specifically on a project that is known to use big data or machine learning, but every software project we're on is inherently a data project. So why is this important? Why do we care? What happens when we use incomplete data sets, for example? What happens when we are not thinking technical decisions are actually political and ethical decisions? I'm just going to head over to Maya and have her sort of lead that section.
Cool. So we've mostly stayed away from specific tools and specific implementations of testing and thinking about data ethical use. We're more talking in generic ways of thinking about things. Because, you know, tools are tools and tools change all the time, but what doesn't change is the way we think about things. So a whole bunch of examples, and I'm going to be covering in this little section one of the subsets of ethical data use, which is what happens when we don't consider our users very thoroughly and limit ourselves to thinking that the world is made up of certain kinds of people. I don't know if you've seen this book around, Invisible Women, Caroline Criado-Perez. Really worth reading. Not entirely intersectional, like it very much focuses on women sort of as a fairly homogenous group without breaking it down possibly enough, is one of the criticisms it receives. On the other hand, it's a brilliant example of what happens when everyone assumes that the average, or rather the most common human being, and that, you know, the normal human being is probably an adult, healthy, young, probably able-bodied, Caucasian, European descent male person. And the effects are kind of staggering when you look at them in a summary like that. Things like chairs aren't the right height, but also, for example, seat belts are designed for a certain kind of body type. Technically, every time I drive, I am out of position according to the manufacturers of the seatbelt, which means I am in higher danger if, in case of a road accident. There's a lot of stuff around medicine creation. There's generally been a bit of a tendency to go, well, all those women people with their lady bits and their very complex hormones, we can't control for that too much when we're doing studies into how new therapies affect bodies. So we'll just not include them in the study. And then it turns out that the medication works completely differently on different bodies. It's, look, really worth looking into it. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, published a study a couple of years ago that did a whole heap of modeling and calculating of what would happen if we had fewer issues that stop women specifically entering the formal paid economy. And the models generally say, unsurprisingly, that if we have fewer marginalizations factors of women, we have way more women doing work and a much healthier, more rich economy, which is one aspect of the value of it. What I really want to point out is that this is one particular kind of marginalization and one particular demographic that we've thought to measure. What happens if we apply the same kind of metrics to other people, other groups, not just, you know, the male-female disparities are big, long, well-known, at least well-critiqued issue. But if we extend that thinking to other kinds of users, we have more ways in which we can consider the differences that the world would have if we weren't leaving some of our users out of the picture. Here's an example of a machine learning issue, which we've mostly tried to stay away from because that's a big, well-known, it's one of the subsets. Yeah, this was a thing that was happening a while ago. Somebody bought a new camera, took photos of their family, and the camera kept trying to tell them, hey, did you blink? Turned out yeah, they're an Asian family, and the people that created the software that runs the camera assumed a different kind of user. Here is another example of taking into account a specific kind of user. So in genomics, most genetic analysis is done on European descended people for various reasons. I'm just going to throw around, you know what, I'm not even going to go into why. Let's just go, that's the reality of it. That again has serious implications for the ways that we administer medicine, for the ways that we develop therapies. What this study found is that because there was so little genetic, well, there was fairly controlled genetic diversity in the genomics that were being studied, what they found is really unexpected things, or at least unexpected if you didn't take this into account, is that, for example, kids with as much, just 10% Native American ancestry with a particular kind of childhood leukemia needed an extra session of chemotherapy to respond to the treatment. So there were all these kids that were going through really quite unpleasant chemotherapy treatments on top of the effects of their cancer, and just not getting the benefits of it because they just needed an extra round for that to be effective for them. And there's gazillions of stories like that. The point is, if we constrain what we understand of the data, if we have the wrong model of what the world is because we choose not to look at the data, or we leave some people out of it, we don't consider who our users are, or we don't do appropriate hygiene on the data we have, we don't have a real understanding of what the world is. We have an inaccurate model of the world, and then we try and develop solutions that don't work, and we don't understand why. And often because we don't understand, we don't even see them. And technology, technology introduces risks. Technology is fast. The decisions that we make when we create software solutions amplify the decisions that we make about who our users are and what are the services that we need to provide them, which means that it's a double-edged sword. It can introduce risks, it can be used to mitigate risk. And because it's so fast and it's so widespread, and technology use is actually, fairly ubiquitous, caveat, just doing generic human intervention doesn't have quite the same effect either way than doing it with tech. Now, the problem is we're dealing with risks and we're dealing with reality. And the issue with thinking about ethics is that it's often easy to fall into the trap of going, well, look, I'm generally a good person. I'm generally trying to do the right thing. That's true. But none of us happen to be a sphere, a perfect sphere in a frictionless world the way we were taught in physics lectures. There is no such thing as the right thing. There is the right thing for the constraints you've got. And often reality is a little bit more complex. Often there are messy consequences and messy political, personality-driven issues that are driving things. And what we're talking about is minimizing harm. And in the same way that we're always constantly doing ethics one way or another, minimizing harm is one of those things that we can do iteratively. And what we've done, Suzan and I, is we've talked to a bunch of people who've been on a variety of software projects, and we've kind of gathered a few insights from the ways that they've found good iterative ways to improve the ethical treatment of the data use on the projects that they've been on. And I'll let Suzan talk about that.
Thank you, Maya. So we're going to sort of talk about some of the recurring themes and principles we found within teams that did maybe not a better job, but maybe thought a bit more about how they were using their data and how that can be up to the best ethical level, or as Maya said, the right thing for their current constraints. Some of them were good, some of them were bad, some of them were ugly, some of them were weird, but this is sort of what we found to be true amongst almost, if not all of them. The first principle basically is not really a principle per se, but it's something that the team needs to remind themselves of and keep in mind. Knowing the most ethical path is not really very simple. It's not an easy thing to do, especially when we think about the complexity of real life situations and how are we supposed to deal with the realistic constraints. The textbook says black and white, but the world is shades of gray. And when we think about then implementing it, that becomes even harder. So it's knowing that it's okay for it to be hard. It's okay for it not to be the right thing, but it's just thinking about maybe, is there a way for us to have ethics first principles to follow? How will that change our perspective? How will that change the questions we're asking? Another one is having a dedicated champion on the team actually ended up having a massive impact. Just like teams, for example, might have a dedicated security champion, which we mentioned earlier is only a subset of ethical data use. This is just ensuring that the team has the type of dedication and focus that they've agreed together is important. And this can also be a role and doesn't have to be specifically the same person all the time. One of the most recurring themes we found and principles was to ask questions early. And matter of fact, I'm actually going to extend on that. Not just asking questions early, doing almost everything you can early. Thinking of the sources of truth early, validating and testing data integrity as early as possible, considering the need for PII earlier, assessing risks, what could go wrong. Asking all those questions earlier made a huge difference. And it helps bring to the surface things and problems that we might not think of later on. And doing this basically helps us to manage those complexities when the scope is much smaller, people involved are much fewer, the risk is much lower, and things are not in production. So as early as possible was a recurring theme over all the people we talked to. The next one was making high data quality a requirement. And this is something that not everyone had as a, let's say, core focus, but it ended up being present in almost every conversation when we talked about proper data usage. And it changes the mindset of the team of how they test data, how they think about, as we said before, like sampling errors and impurities, and what about the way that we're handling PII. So this is really important to keep in mind when you're starting your testing or starting your pipeline or starting whatever use of data that you have. How can we make high data quality a requirement? And if we did, what would change? One of the most important ones, I think, is that it is always impersonal until it's personal. Nobody believes that data breaches or making users uncomfortable or having users walking away, leaving a service because they actually can't use it. Nobody believes that's going to happen to them, unless it actually happens, until it actually happens, excuse me. And it's sometimes really hard to demonstrate this, especially to all our stakeholders, because we're essentially trying to demonstrate an absence. We're trying to show that things would have been much worse otherwise. And this is where it can be really useful to get someone to come and tell their story of what it happened to them. Examples about companies and organizations where someone may be left under not the best circumstances for whatever reason. So it becomes then a useful model to consider the effects of, what if we had a disgruntled ex-employee? What do they know? What damage could they cause? Even if we don't have bad relations with anyone, it's still useful to think, well, what if we did? And what effect could they have on the data we have and how we use it? And how would that then affect our users? And when it comes to the disgruntled ex-employee, for example, we all have one. It's almost impossible not to. Sooner or later, there will be a situation that maybe we're not very prepared for, and then we haven't considered the implications and the impact and the effects of our data being exposed or used in a way that we haven't planned for. So basically what we're saying is we found that teams who prioritize those principles or those themes ended up doing a few things quite differently. And now we're going to look at a few ways that those principles manifested where pragmatic solutions were taking. So don't be shocked if you find maybe that you might already be implementing some of those, and maybe you already are testing for ethical data use. But if not, here are a few ideas that you can bring forward to your team. For one, we noticed that there's a higher ethical data test automation in those teams. And one way that they managed to do that was to use Talisman, and that will stop devs checking in user IDs and passwords. Another way that teams were practicing better ethical use of data was that they were using more checklists. Checklists for encryption, for data lake locations. It can be checklists on the card themselves. Before creating a card, before breaking down a story, are we answering the questions and asking the questions that we wanted to ask? And a great way to involve stakeholders more in these decisions and get them on board. Sometimes there might be some friction or resistance or rebuttals. A good way to get them involved is to have threat modeling workshops and involve the stakeholders as well. This will raise awareness of what can go wrong, what impact that risk, whatever that risk may be, can have, and then thinking of ways to mitigate it in advance. Another one was data validation and quality tests, and doing those tests at each level. So whether it's unit integration or end-to-end, data validation was introduced, and it wasn't something that we did when only we had to, or at the very end. It was something that had to go through the entire pyramid. Next, we had testing PII components with fake PII. So other than, what I love about this is that other than the fact that we're not using past prod data to test with, when you actually use fake PII data to test your components, you get to see how they perform. Is the PII data being handled, masked, stripped away the way you expect? Are you finding it in places that it shouldn't have been? And this is a good way to sort of make sure that you're getting what you're expecting to get before, again, as early as possible. We also noticed that some teams were using the data to have some sort of analysis of how the data quality is changing over time. For example, one of them where they used a metric, which is basically a percentage of data linkage across data sets. And they calculated that metric and showed that put that into a monitoring dashboard and shared it with some data custodians, and then worked closely with those custodians to decide on monitoring and alerting thresholds. Integrating data QA into the pipeline. So one way you can do that is using Jupyter notebooks, and the outputs were included in the project's documentation itself and then auto-updated every single day. This way, again, it's not an afterthought. Data quality is actually integrated within the pipeline itself. Finally, we also saw that a good example of testing whether we're actually using the data we're gathering and we're only gathering what we need is to maybe test the effect of randomizing that data. So how many times is any piece of gathered data being used? If we randomize it and we see that the effect on the users or the data or the model, it didn't change much, that is indicating that a piece of data is not really used much. So it helps us identify what we need versus what we have. So let's say this is all sounding, wonderful, and in an ideal world, everyone will be open to it and not a problem, everyone's on board, but that's not always the reality. So how do we actually talk about this with our teams? So I'm going to hand over to Maya for this section.
Yeah, so look, I think Susan's covered actually a lot of the kinds of thinking around this. And I think the point we really wanted to make is that testing for ethical use just requires thinking about, just requires thinking about all the different aspects of it and whether they're being done to the level that we really want to be doing them. And what are the trade-offs that we could be doing differently in order to do something that's a bit more ethical. And again, talking about it with other people gets a bit messy and complicated. And I don't know about you, but every once in a while, something happens or someone says something around me, and I do the thing that Hannah Gadsby calls, you know, going to the pufferfish. I just get so angry. And I found that for me, it's really useful to have different kinds of phrases around to change the conversation so that I don't just shout at people. For example, you don't have to use the word ethics at all. Like there's absolutely no reason to bring the word ethics into it to create more ethical use of data. We can talk about reputational risk and financial risk, which are things that people tend to care about a lot. Same with privacy. Privacy and ethics are things that everyone has feelings and opinions about, and they're hard to be objective about, and most of us don't have enough grounding to be able to have the conversations in the same way. But talking about compliance, very easy. It's easy. It's a lot easier to just go, well, this is what the law says. Sure, the law is up for interpretation, but it's there. I do tend to get a bit angry about gender policing. Those are not women's clothes, they're clothes. Color doesn't have a gender. But it's much easier for other people to see my point of view when I talk about alienating users. And the example I give is that if I open up a site and it wants to, and it demands my gender and it only has male or female, for example, I will, 9/10 of the time, I will close the site and try and find another service. And I'm definitely at the age now where I write angry letters, or I suppose in the ways of our people, cranky tweets. Yeah, we should gather less data. Absolutely. Datum spartum bacon. Hang on, let me try and say it as Berger instructed everyone in the chat. Thank you.
Datensparsamkeit.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, I'll just carry a recording of you everywhere I go. And the point is, why do we need this data? What happens if we don't capture this field? And again, one of the ways to demonstrate that you don't need the data is to replace it with different data and see what effect it has, just to show that there's no value in it, that it actually isn't doing anything. And everyone's got a bit of FOMO about that, don't they? I want all this data. Okay. Again, oh. Excuse me. I tend to, you know, I tend to get angry and say, but look, I close the website when this asks me to do the thing. And people here, yeah, a few people will care about it, whatever. So what is generally a much more constructive conversation is to talk about how do we make this more inclusive for everyone? How do we make this a better, more inclusive feature for all of the users that we have, not just who we think our users are? Okay, here we go. So, don't know about you, it sounds like most of us are really quite aware of the issue. Here are the kinds of things you're likely to hear, right? People will say things like, I have nothing to hide, and a really nice rebuttal to it is, do you close the door when you pee? And there's more to it than that, but basically a lot of people will say things like, I have nothing to hide, I don't care if people know this about me. And it's kind of nice to demonstrate the difference between, yep, you still have some boundaries of privacy, don't you? In the same way that people say, I don't care if anybody knows my address or name or sexual preference or whatever. And a useful response to that is that that might be true for you, and that might even be true for me, but there's a lot of people who can't make information free or can't do the effects that they have in the world if everybody knows this information about them. And so it's not about the golden rule of do unto others as you would unto yourself, as it's more the platinum rule of what would the other person want. And some of the biggest demonstrations we have in the world of what happens when we do let people have the freedom of not having this information available about them is, for example, journalistic integrity. or the ability to talk about real experiences and changing people's minds about what it's like to live a different kind of life, or even balanced hiring, where we've seen a lot of that kind of thing. Oh yeah, here we go, the FOMO. But what if we need this later? Look, again, the simplest argument is just, here's the cost of gathering all of the information ever. Here's the cost of gathering it, of storing it, of keeping it, of doing all this stuff with it. How about, here is an alternative solution. People really like it when you give them alternative solutions, it turns out. What about we interpolate it, or how about we just don't gather it for a bit and see what happens? And then if we find that we absolutely need it, we'll do it. How about we come up with a real use case and then we'll do it, and think about ways we can work around not having it if we do find out that we need it. Yep, we'll test for data integrity at the end. Yeah, you know what? I'm not even going to spend too long on that, because I think we've all been in the situation where people want to do things at the end. And it's one of those things. Once upon a time, people used to talk about testing at the end as well. And we live in a different world now. And I'm not going to belabor the point. I think we've probably all heard all of those points. Yeah, here we go. This is my favorite. We've never had any issues and it's a lot of work. People used to say that about QA. People used to say that about CD, CI. And again, one of the best rebuttals to that is to have real narrative about it. Bring in somebody who can talk about when it's happened to them, or at my last company, or here is a case study of a company that's very similar to ours that's ended up on the front of the Herald Sun. And this is the thing. In the same way that appropriate testing practices, most of the time, yeah, they'll improve, you know, on a small enough code base, it's no big deal. And I mean, you know, most of the time, it doesn't cause anything horrific to not have it. But the couple of times when it causes something terrible, the recovery and the consequences are so bad that it's worth doing it all the time. Okay, let's very quickly cover some of the many resources that are out there for framing and thinking around this kind of issue. And I'd just like to point out that it's Thursday, so there's probably been 2 more new ones released this week, because there's a lot of them out there. Here we go. These are just some of the ones that we like. Ethical OS, really good, kind of breaks data and software projects and whatever into different kinds of risk zones, so you can focus on them separately. Very similar to threat modeling. In fact, a lot of this thinking is very similar to threat modeling. The ethics litmus test, you might have come across it. I don't think Laura Summers is here today, but a lot of people here probably know Laura Summers. She's published those fairly recently, and they're sort of like a little fortune for the day card. Pull that out and think about, if we go with this decision, will this make a good episode of Black Mirror, for example? And if it does, maybe we shouldn't do that. Okay, the tarot cards of tech, I really love them. I really love the concept of tarot cards in general. Because what they are a way of thinking about elements of narrative. And human beings, we live and die by the stories we tell ourselves and the stories we tell each other. And the aspects that tarot cards provide are archetypes of characters or events or forces that you might encounter during a narrative sequence. And a narrative sequence is, this happened and that happened and that happened. And the tarot cards of tech take the kinds of forces and events and actors that we might encounter around a software project. And again, they're just a way of doing framed thinking around this kind of thing. The Design Ethically Toolkit, yep, it's really good. I think on the next slide, what it is a bunch of specific exercises that you can use around your project, around your work. A really good exercise to do is just pull it out and try and run it on the project you've got, even run it on a project you've just been on or were doing, so that the first time you're running it, you're not doing it in anger and you're just getting a sense of how it works. A lot of useful tools in there. Yep, the ODI, the ODI data ethics canvas, again, different kinds of frameworks, different kinds of breaking up the forces that influence the decisions that we make. Data ethics toolkit is much more tool focused, really useful stuff there. Yep. And I think we can skip that one. There's a few different, look, there are so many of these kinds of ways of thinking about it. And if you type ethical data toolkit or framework into Google, you will find that humanity has done nothing but produce versions of it. And they're all actually fairly similar ultimately, in that frameworks are fairly established, but you might find that some of them work better for the way you think or for the ways that your project or your team communicates. Whichever one it is that works for you is, you know, the correct tool is the one that works for you. Okay.
All right. So we're coming towards the end of our presentation. We know that it's late on a Thursday. We don't want to hold you up much longer. To quickly summarize, when we started, we talked about the ethical use of data as the application of ethical practices to data collection, storage, processing, decisioning, and deleting. So a good way to think about how might we test for that is to maybe think about how you will test each one of these applications to your data. The basic summary of ethics and data is that you already probably do ethics. All the decisions we do have an ethical lens on them. All the technical decisions will have an ethical component. And it comes to balancing the realistic constraints you have on every single software project, because every single software project will have data components. If we misunderstand the world and we misunderstand that data, we're creating bad solutions. We don't even sometimes know we're creating those bad solutions. We're creating maybe sometimes solutions that may not be labeled as bad, but they're solutions that we don't want. And if we misrepresent that data, we can end up causing harm to a subset of groups that we are not thinking about. For example, one of the tarot cards was the forgotten. So we need to make sure that we're using the right kind of data, we're actually applying it in the right way, and we're testing in a healthy way for it. And when we think of ethical data testing, the same way we iterate on quality of code, refactoring, security, this is just another way in which quality is measured. We need to think about ongoing improvements of ethical practices rather than a big bang approach. And yes, sometimes you do or might have a big bang approach at the very beginning or need it, but every once in a while we can maybe work iteratively and ask questions to reflect on current behaviors, the decisions we're making, the practices, and challenge whether our use of data is extending to the highest level of ethics we can uphold. And like every other aspect of engineering, it's basically a question of making the best decisions you can within the constraints you've got. So if this sort of looks familiar and sounds familiar, and you're thinking, well, this is similar to our Agile practices, and we are mostly all using Agile now at this time, well, that makes sense because the Agile framework was basically designed to accommodate for realistic aspects of software projects, and ethical data testing is just another aspect that you can include. How easy will it be to include ethical de-risking within our Agile framework? So given everything we've talked about today, we want to leave you with one question. What is the one thing you could do differently tomorrow? And this is a question you can take with you, part of your homework. But we're also open to questions if you have any. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Suzan and Maya. That was fantastic. And I think there's a real treasure trove of little nuggets of things that we can all take away from that. As you mentioned, some of those things people might already be doing. But yeah, there's a lot of things that you've covered off there that perhaps we haven't thought of recently, and stuff which is really great. So thank you.
Thank you. I might stop sharing so I can see everyone. Does anyone mind?
No, that's fine.
Cool. Any questions?
Yeah, I have a question. when you talk about testing, I kind of imagine that just looking like a review process that you put in every, 3 or 6 months. Can you shed some more light on what an ethical test for data collection, say, might look like?
Okay, can I throw that back to the audience and see if we have some examples anyone wants to share before we answer? We have a lot of brilliant thought workers here that might have something to share.
And plenty of people who are brilliant who are not thought workers.
Yes, sorry. All right, well, I think as we've seen from before, it's having those conversations early, right? And all the tools that we shared are basically somewhat of a placeholder for a conversation. So it doesn't, the every 3 to 6 months idea, I think that's the maybe a symptom of a bigger issue. And it's thinking, how can we bring that forward, bring that earlier? Why does it have to be only every 3 to 6 months? What are we achieving when we are doing that? What are we looking at? So if you could expand on that for a bit, because I think that's separate than you said, I think data collection, is that the second part of your question?
I was just using collection as an example, but I understand what you're saying. I think that it's a continuous process rather than an iterative.
Look, it's a bit of both, and I think like a review every 3 to 6 months is actually a really fair thing to do. In the same way that you stop every once in a while and go, how are we doing? Are we doing things right? What could we be doing better in general? And having an actual stop point every once in a while where you re-examine your assumptions and re-examine your tooling and think about what you're doing is actually really valuable to do, as long as that's something that's instituted from somewhere, and the changes can come at any time. Otherwise, you don't want all your changes to be reactive, but you also don't want all of them to be so spread out that you haven't given it enough thought on how you can make things better right now.
Yes, and I think what I was trying to say is the questions and goals and requirements for the check we're doing or the testing we're doing every 3 to 6 months, for example, reassessing our assumptions, checking how data is changing over time. That's not something that you can do constantly or iteratively, let's say every single week, every single iteration. But those are different to the questions and the goals and requirements from when we say, can we maybe test this earlier? Can we look at the data we're collecting and check that it's coming from the right source? Check that it's, not redundant, check that it's actually accurate. So I think it comes back to the questions we're asking and the requirements that you have. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does answer. Thank you.
I have something to add in here. So I know that the best case as a techie, when I think something in the pipeline that checks it automatically, but that's like, I think, long way to go. But in a couple of projects, what we have tried to do is, it's a manual process, but with every user story kickoff, we have a sort of checklist where we check like what we do as a threat modeling and ethical modeling, basically, just to make sure that if we are collecting the data or any sort of processing, is there something we are breaking? So we have a list of questions, or it depends on organizations or companies, but attaching it to every story and evaluating with what you consider as ethics or threat, I mean, both sides could help.
Yeah, and extending on that, one of the teams that we talked to, for example, they managed to put a lot of automation and testing on data gathering, let's say, and they used that automatic process to establish 3 types of lists: a white list that didn't need any human intervention, a list of maybe data that would be classified to require some human monitoring and approval, and then a list of data that they weren't even going to use or need, for example. So it can take many different forms. It's just because they thought, how can we make sure, it was a higher requirement in their case that the data needed to be very accurate, the data needed to be consolidated, and they needed to be, like they had cleaner, more accurate data than sometimes even the people providing that data to them. So it depends, I guess.
I'm not sure if this is a good example, but one case I came across was one where we built a pipeline for data, and it was initially designed and spec'd for a specific purpose, and we were consuming and processing data for a discrete region geographically. And we had built everything with a profile based on that, and it was only when we went back in the future or went back at a later point in time and looked at and reprofiled that data that we realised that other parts of the business and the organisation had now changed, and it didn't just have data for that particular region. That pipeline was now processing data for a range of other regions, and we hadn't gone and done an assessment and really thought through the implications of what that exposes for other regions and stuff to now use those same pipelines and push additional data that we didn't know about initially at the design time. So that was sort of a good case, I felt, where being able to go back and do periodic reviews and reprofile the data and make sure that what you expected to be there was still there, and that as businesses had changed and requirements had changed, that you hadn't sort of crossed some of those boundaries that you understood were there in the first place. Do we have any other questions? Does anybody else have any thoughts?
I did have a question. Let me see if I can remember it. You said something about like not collecting data that you don't need straight away. And I love the idea, but in practice, like, yeah, how realistic is it really, like, to know? Because I mean, that to me, that also implies that you should stop collecting data that you no longer have a use for. So when that use case for your data disappears, you should stop collecting that data and delete it. But in my experiences, a lot of organizations don't really have that holistic understanding about where and how their data is used and what the end-to-end flow is, and how to safely remove those kinds of data collection points and processing points without breaking the whole organization. So how realistic is it really to build that into your regular testing and development?
Such a good question. And it ties back to the idea of FOMO, you know, if I can have it, I'll have it, and it's cheap, so why not? And it is often a really hard mindset to shift. And thinking of it trying to frame it in terms of what happens if this data gets out doesn't always shift people's minds, because then they go, oh, we've got all this data. You know, if some of it gets out, it's probably all getting out. And so, you know, why stop there? A really good way to think about it is often, well, this is an asset that we have. And like all of our assets, we need to have a proper life cycle planning for it. And having assets that aren't providing value, but are taking up space and causing us costs, tends to frame the conversation a lot better. And having an asset management plan, you know, this is the conversation that tends to be had a lot about, you know, is data the new oil or is data the new asbestos? I personally think it's kind of the new radioactive isotope, where very powerful, very useful, very dangerous upon contact, needs very careful disposal and management. And when we talk of it in terms of what are the consequences of having it and what is the consequence of not getting rid of it and not removing it, again, it can be a bit hard to demonstrate an absence of a problem, you know, an absence of anything. How do you prove you don't have an issue? Yeah, it's a bit of an interesting conceptual thing, but talking about consequences we have because we do have it, like costs, that tends to shift the conversation a fair way.
I think it's important to mention again that there is no right answer. There is no what is the right thing for as you said, what is the realistic approach? It's whatever the right thing looks like within that within those constraints that you have. And it's a very complex issue, and it's a place where we are constantly having negotiations. And sometimes we can very eloquently put them in the ways that Maya just did, and it's clear and concise, and we could illustrate the cause and the use case for it, but sometimes we can't. And it's mainly coming from the mindset of, are we even asking that question? So you might have that example where we don't need that data anymore. There's no more use case, but nobody even mentions the disposal of it. And this is basically saying, should we ask that question? Yes. Are we asking that question? Maybe not. If we did, what are the kinds of conversations we will have? And that's a step above a lot of other examples currently that are taking place where we're not even having those conversations.
Did that answer your question?
Well, it did, but I think it sort of opened up a larger problem, because like in any project where you've got funding to deliver some sort of outcome, it's always about new features. It's always about collecting more data and doing more with it. Like no one ever funds a project to remove features, which I think is actually a problem, because a lot of large legacy organizations are really slowed down because they never retire anything. And that's why luckily startups can compete with them, because they don't have that legacy. But like that tends to not be part of how businesses work, whether it's agile or not. Like it's always about, oh yeah, we've got this new use case, we've got this new user story, we've got this new requirement, this new customer, this new opportunity. It's not about reviewing on a regular basis, what do we already have, and do we still need it, and is it still serving us?
That's a really good point, and framing it as opportunity cost. What are we not able to do because we are maintaining this? What new things can we not have because we are holding on to what we do have and the ways that we're doing things? Yeah, and like Tim made a good point in the chat that storing, processing all this data has all these hidden costs that you don't even see, and sometimes they're performance, sometimes they're sometimes they're easy to see, like storage costs, but sometimes they're big performance issues. And doing back with the envelope calculations even about these. What we have, what we do, the ways that we already do things are in fact the constraints that stop us becoming something else.
Yes, exactly. But
good, we're in violent agreement.
We are, in theory, but in practice, I just don't see it happening a lot, or not really.
Yep. But a lot of things are a good idea and we don't see them happening a lot. So what can I tell you?
Yeah, okay.
Look, and again, any small change forward is more than no change forward.
Yes, and we made no promises that we were going to give you the answer.
No, I know you didn't. I know. And I haven't given up on this, and I love everything you said, and especially about every project is a data project, and think about it early. But yeah, keep thinking about it continuously too. Yeah. Awesome.
And I must add, with the teams that we spoke to, none of them came to us and said, oh, it was a breeze to get everyone on board. Oh, everybody agreed to this idea when we put it forward. We had no resistance whatsoever when we started doing this or that. It was a struggle for every single one, and they had to have some type of push and force. And there's a lot more that they wanted to do, and they could have done it a bit better. But you do what you can, and you push for what you can get when it comes to ethical use of data.
I specifically like that line you had about minimizing harm. It's quite a good one. Thank you very much. I think we've recorded the presentation, so hopefully we'll be able to make that available after the